Hey, what's going on, family? It's me, baby girl Slaughter, Carolyn Denise, back to do another short reading. This one is going to be short. I'm trying to chop them up to where I don't lose people in, hour and a half to 2 hour content. I know my sons were telling me that I need to try to make these videos shorter. On my longer readings over the weekends, I will attempt to keep it at under an hour. But I mean, it's just a lot of information, you guys. It is. It really is. And for anybody who's an avid researcher and who loves to read, then you can appreciate the fact that um, this information takes time to digest and to process, right? So yesterday I jumped on here and I was reading from the Smoky God, okay, A Voyage to the Inner World by Willis George Emerson. I've read over chapter 1, introduction, chapter 1, and then chapter 2, and now we're going into, chapter 2. So I broke it up into like bits and chunks. Yeah, bits and chunks. I'm reading about 4 different books right now in rotation with you guys, so that's why I'm trying to keep these short. I am going to come back on here, if not tonight, tomorrow, and do a reading over Tesla and the Cabbage Patch Kids, as well as Flying Serpents and Dragons and Murder of Reality, the hidden symbolism of the dragon, quote unquote, the reptilians, my favorite topic. And of course, I may do some things over on Ascension too as well. So let me just get into part 2. This is going to be a short read. We're not going to finish the whole chapter. Okay. So it says, my name is Olaf Jensen. I'm a Norwegian. Although I was born in the little seafaring Russian town of Juliaborg on the eastern coast of the Gulf of Bothnia, the northern arm of the Baltic Sea. My parents were on a fishing cruise in the Gulf of Bothnia and put into this Russian town of Juliaborg at the time of my birth, being 27th day of October, 1811. Notice how these things happen right after the reset, when all this information was coming out and people were doing exploring. And now you don't hear about any of that stuff today, right? My father, James Jensen, was born at Rodwig on the Scandinavian coast near Lofoten Islands, but after marrying, made his home in Stockholm because my mother's people resided in that city. When 7 years old, I began going with my father on his fishing trips along the Scandinavian coast. Early in life, I displayed an aptitude for books, and at the age of 9 years old, was placed in a private school in Stockholm, remaining there until I was 14. After this, I made regular trips with my father, all on his fishing voyages. My father was a man fully 6 feet 3 height and weighed over 15 stone, a typical Norseman of the most rugged sort and capable of more endurance than any other man I had ever known. He possessed the gentleness of a woman in tender little ways, yet his determination and willpower were beyond description. He will admit it of no defeat. I was in my 19th year when started on what proved to be our last trip as a fisherman, and which resulted in the strange story that shall be given to the world, but not until I finish my earthly pilgrimage. I dare not allow the facts as I know them to be published while I am living, for fear or further humiliation, confinement, and suffering. First of all, I was put in the irons by the captain of a whaling vessel that rescued me for no other reason than I had told him the truth about the marvelous discoveries made by my father and myself. But this was far from being the end of my tortures. Now, you got to think back at that time frame, early the 1800s, mid 1800s, and then up into the 1900s. They were doing a lot of still reconstruction, and a lot of things they did not want to come out, because you got to remember, not too long ago, a couple hundred years prior, they had destroyed all of the civilization as we know it. And this was the beginning of the onslaught of the New World Order, right? So anybody who has remnants or history or knowledge was either destroyed or murdered, unalived, put in asylums, children were taken, Cabbage Patch babies were put in different orphanages and trained up and then knowledge that they wanted them to know. And also, they were harvesting and cloning people at that time too. We had the technology a long time ago, y'all. I'm just going to keep it 100. So then he says, after 4 years and 8 months absence, I reached Stockholm only to find my mother had died the previous year, and the property left by my parents in the possession of my mother's people. But it was at once made over to me. All rights had been well, had I erased from my memory the story of our adventure and my father's terrible death. Finally, one day, I told the story in detail to my uncle, Gustav Osterlin. You should have never done that, y'all. Sometimes you need to keep your mouth shut, family and no family, friends and no friends. You just need to keep your mouth shut on certain aspects. So it says, a man of considerable property, and I urged him to fit out an expedition for me to make another voyage to the strange lands. So see, he opened his mouth up thinking he could trust his uncle. And because his uncle had property and money and probably connections, he thought his uncle would do right by him. Check this out. At first, I thought he favored my project. He seemed interested and invited me to go before certain officials and explain to them, as I had to him, the story of our travels and discoveries. Imagine my disappointment and horror when, upon the conclusion of my narrative, certain papers were signed by my uncle, and without warning, I found myself arrested and hurried away to dismissal and fearful confinement in a damn madhouse. They put him in a nut house, an asylum. And he says, where I remained for 28 years. 28 years. My youngest son is that age, okay? Or will be that age. And can you imagine? That's damn near a lifetime for some people, all right? So he was put in there for 28 years, long and tedious, frightful years of suffering. I never ceased to assert my sanity and to protest against the injustice of my confinement. Finally, on the 17th of October, 1862, he was released. My uncle was dead, and his friends of my youth were now strangers. And my friends of my youth were now strangers. Indeed, a man over 50 years old, whose only known record is that of a madman, has no friends. I was at a loss to know what to do for a living, but instinctively turned toward the harbor where fishing boats in great numbers were anchored. And within a week, I had shipped with a fisherman by the name of Jan Hansen, who was starting on a long fishing cruise to the Lofoten Islands. That's where his dad's from. Here, my earlier years of training proved of the very greatest advantage, especially enabling me to make myself useful. This was about the beginning of other trips, and by frugal economy, I was, in a few years, able to own a fishing brig of my own. So that's good. He got a nut house and he got a job and he bought a boat. Okay. For 27 years thereafter, I followed the sea as a fisherman. Okay. 5 years working for others, and the last 22 for myself. So, you know, he got out at 50. So who is down there, 70, 75 years old? All right. It's crazy. During all these years, I was the most diligent student of books, as well as a hard worker at my business. But I took great care not to mention to anyone the story concerning the discoveries made by my father and myself. Even at this late day, I would be fearful of having anyone see or know the things I am writing and the records and the maps. So you see, he was traumatized because all the shit he went through based on who he was talking to. First, it was a whaling captain, and then it was a so-called uncle, his family member. Okay, so I can see why he was very, he kept this close to the chest, and he didn't want to expose any more information. Okay, so this is him. You know, you followed me when we were reading. He ushered this gentleman to come in at 2 a.m. in the morning so he could give him these maps, tell him the story, and give him drawings, and tell him about this expedition that he went on with his father. Okay, so he hadn't spoke of this in years. Okay, so then he said, I would be fearful of having anyone see or know the things I am writing and the records and maps I have in my keeping. When my days on earth are finished, I shall leave maps and records that will enlighten and, I hope, benefit mankind. Exactly. The memory of my long confinement with maniacs and all the horrible anguish and sufferings are too vivid to warrant my further chances, further discussions. Just leave that shit in the past. Keep it moving, bro. Just keep it pushing. In 1889, I sold out my fishing boats and found I had accumulated a fortune quite significant, quite sufficient to keep me in the remainder of my life. I then came to America. Okay. And let's see, I got a few more minutes. For a dozen years, my home was in Illinois near Batavia, where I gathered most of the books in my present library, though I brought many choice volumes from Stockholm. Later, I came to Los Angeles, arriving here March the 4th, 1901. Now, you got to remember he was born in 1811, right? October 1811. So he came to Los Angeles in March the 4th, 1901. The date I will well remember as it was President McKinley's second inauguration day. I bought this humble home and determined here in the privacy of my own abode, sheltered by my own vine and fig tree, and with all my books about me, to make maps and drawings of the new lands we had discovered, and also to write the story in detail from the time my father and I left Stockholm until the tragic event that parted us in the Antarctic Ocean. I will remember that we left Stockholm in our fishing slope on the 3rd day of April, 1829, and sailed to the southward, leaving Gothard Island to the left and Åland Island to the right. A few days later, we succeeded in doubling the Sodholm Point and made our way through the sound which separates Denmark from the Scandinavian coast. In due time, we put in at a town of Kristiansand, where we rested 2 days and then started around the Scandinavian coast to the westward bound for the Lofoten Islands. My father was in high spirit because of the excellent and gratifying returns he had received from our last catch by marketing at Stockholm instead of selling at one of the seafaring towns along the Scandinavian coast. He was especially pleased with the sale of some ivory tusks that he had found on the west coast of Franz Josef Land during one of his northern cruises the previous year. And he had expressed the hope that this time we might again be fortunate enough to load our little fishing slope with ivory instead of cod and herring and mackerel and salmon. So they were taking a trip to see if they could go find these tusks, okay? We put in the Hammerfest latitude 71 degrees and 40 minutes for a few days rest. Here we remained a week, laying an extra supply of provisions and several casks of drinking water, and then sailed toward Spitzbergen. For the first few days, we had an open sea and favoring wind, and then we encountered much ice and many icebergs. A vessel larger than our little fishing slope could not possibly have threaded its way among the labyrinth of icebergs or squeezed through the barely open channels. These monster bergs presented an endless succession of crystal palaces and massive cathedrals, fantastic mountain ranges. So I'm only picturing the ice as I'm reading this, how beautiful these icebergs, these big, huge chunks of ice are, how mammoth sized they are, right? And it says, there was massive cathedrals and fantastic mountain ranges, grim and sentinel-like, immovable, so some towering cliff of solid rock, standing silent as a sphinx, resting the restless waves in a frightful sea. And he has a picture of one like this. I can only imagine. After many narrow escapes, we arrived at the Spitzbergen on the 23rd day of June and anchored at Wajid Bay for a short time, where we were quite successful in our catches. We then lifted another anchor, sailed through the Huffington Strait, and coasted along the north end East Land. It will be remembered that Andre started on his fatal balloon voyage from the northwest coast of Spitzbergen. Okay, so that we just got to keep that in mind for future reference. A strong wind came up from the southwest, and my father said that we had better take advantage of it and try to reach Franz Josef Land, where the year before he had been by accident found the ivory tusks that had brought him such a good price at Stockholm. Okay. Never before or since have I seen so many seafowl. They were so numerous, and they had hid the rocks on the coastline and darkened the sky. For several days we sailed along the rocky coast of Franz Joseph Land, and finally a favoring wind came up that enabled us to make the west coast, and after sailing 24 hours, we came to a beautiful inlet. I can only imagine how the water looked. Going through the icebergs and just open sea, and then you see all these birds on the land, and then you see this beautiful, beautiful, picturesque view. That's what's in my mind as I'm reading. One could hardly believe it was the Northland. The place were green with growing vegetation, while the area did not comprise more than 1 or 2 acres. Yet the air was warm and it was tranquil. It seemed to be at that point where the Gulf Stream's influence is most keenly felt. On the East Coast, there were numerous icebergs, yet here we were in open water. Far to the west of us, however, were ice packs, and still further to the westward, the ice appeared like ranges of low hills. In front of us and directly to the north lay the open sea. My father was an ardent believer in Odin and Thor, better known as Enki and Enlil. All right, I'm going to keep it 100. And had frequently told me they were gods who came from far beyond the north wind. Yeah, they came from beyond the ice walls. There was a tradition. My father explained that still further northward was a land more beautiful than any that mortal man had ever known, and it was inhabited by the chosen. Sir John Bart, FRS, in his work entitled Voyages of Discovery and Research Within the Arctic Region, says on page 57, Mr. Beechey refers to what has frequently been found and noted. Notice the mildness of the temperature of the western coast of Spitsbergen, there being little or no sensation of cold. Though the thermometer might be only a few degrees above the freezing point, the brilliant and lively effect of a clear day when the sun shines forth with a pure sky, whose azure hue is so intense as to find no parallel even in the boasted Italian sky. Captain King on page 299, quoting from Morton's journal, the 26th day of December, says, as far as I could see, the open passages were 15 miles or more wide, with sometimes smashed ice separating them, but it is all small ice, and I think if either dries out to open space to the north or rots and sinks, as I could see none ahead to the north. We find the following Deutsche Mythologies on page 778. So he's given 3 different references of what this place is or what it looks like, okay? From the pen of Jacob Grimm, the son of Bor, built in the middle of the universe, a city called Asgard, where dwell the gods and their kindred, and from the abode worked out so many wondrous things, both on the earth and in the heavens above. Okay, so you got 3 different references that talk about Asgard. 4, if you want to connect that, well, you have 3 different references talking about the Northland or the Antarctic, or the Arctic. And then you have Claudio Nicelli's work, which I read to you guys in detail here on Facebook and also over here on YouTube. Okay, where it talks about the city, the giants that taken the ancestral humans to Asgard. Okay, I remember reading that. So it says, where the gods and their kindred and from the abode work out so many wondrous things, both on the earth and in the heavens above. There is in that city a place called, and let me see, this is Norwegian, so let me see if I can pronounce this, Hadjalaf. And when Odin is seated there upon his lofty throne, he sees over the whole world and discerns all actions of men. Okay. So they say, they monitor everything. They monitor me reading. I'm just telling you, it's not by accident. Okay, I'm going to give you about 5 more minutes of this, and then we're going to shut it down. My youthful imagination was fired by the ardor, the zeal, and the religious fervor of my godfather, and I exclaimed, why not sail to this goodly land? The sky is fair, the wind favorable, and the sea open. Okay. And I just want to make sure I did not skip ahead, because now in my mind when I'm reading to you guys, I'm thinking And I did finish up all of chapter 1, and we're on chapter 2. Okay, but if not, we're skipping around. So we're just going to roll with it, all right? I should have checked that before I started reading, but I'm like, let me just sit down and read. All right, so he says, even now I can see the expression of pleasurable surprise on the countenance as he turned toward me and asked, my son, are you willing to go with me and explore, to go far beyond where man has ever ventured? I answered affirmatively. Very well, he replied. May the god Odin protect us. And quickly adjusting the sails, he glanced at our compass, turned the prow in due northerly direction through an open channel, and our voyage had begun. That is so neat. Father and son taking out the open sea and just cruising and just being together and doing things that only a man could show a son or show a boy, right? A young man. Wish we had more people that did that now. I mean, we do, but it's not on the scale that was back then, right? The sun was low in the horizon. As it was still the early summer, indeed, we had almost 4 months of day ahead of us before the frozen night could come on again. Our little fishing slope sprang forward, as if eager as ourselves for adventure. Within 36 hours, we were at the site of the highest point of the coastline of Franz Josef Land. We seemed to be in a strong current running north by northeast. Far to the right and to the left of us were icebergs. But our little slope bore down on the narrows and passed through channels and out into the open seas. Channels so narrow in places that our craft, been other than small, would have never been gotten through. So these were small passages that they go through the channels and through these, I guess, through the icebergs and through the iceberg ranges and things like that. They had to get through their ship. Good thing they had a small vessel. On the third day, we came in to an island. Its shores were washed by an open sea. My father determined to land and explore for a day. This new land was destitute of timber, but we found a large accumulation of driftwood on the north shore. Some of the trunks of the trees were 40 feet long and 2 feet in diameter. After 1 day's exploration of the coastline of the island, we lifted anchor and turned our prow to the north in an open sea. And he's quoting other passages from other books. Hawes writes on page 288, on the 23rd of the January, the Esquimaux, accompanied by the two of the seamen, went to Captain Lowton and reported the sea of open water extending as far for the eye could reach. Greeley tells us in volume 1, page 100, that private counsels and Frederick found a large coniferous tree on the beach just above the extreme high water mark. It was nearly 30 inches in circumference, some 36 feet long, and had approximately been carried to that point by a current within a couple of years. A portion of it was cut up for firewood, and for the first time in that valley, a bright, cheery campfire gave comfort to man. Dr. Kane says in another page on 379 of his works, I cannot imagine what becomes of the ice. A strong current sets in constantly to the north, but from altitudes of more than 500 feet, I saw only narrow strips of ice with great spaces of open water, from 10 to 15 miles in breadth between them. It must therefore either go to an open space in the north or dissolve. All right, and this is the last part that I'm going to read to you guys right here, and then we're going to shut it down. It says, I remember that neither my father nor myself had tasted food for almost 30 hours. Perhaps this was because of the tension of excitement about a strange voyage in waters further north. My father said that anyone had been before. Okay, so no one had ever traveled these lands before, is what his father was telling him. So they were super excited about this. Active mentality had dulled the demands of the physical needs. Instead of the cold being intense as we had anticipated, it was really warmer and more pleasant than it had been while in Hammerfest on the north coast of Norway some 6 weeks before. We both frankly admitted that we were very hungry, and forthwith I prepared a substantial meal from our well-stored larder. When we had partaken heartily of the repast, I told my father I believed I would sleep as I was beginning to feel quite drowsy. Very well, he replied, I will keep the watch. I have no way to determine how long I slept. I only know that I was rudely awakened by a terrible commotion of the slope. To my surprise, I found my father sleeping soundly. I cried out lustily to him, and stirring up, he sprang quickly to his feet. Indeed, he had not instantly clutched the rail, he would have certainly have been thrown into the seething waves. A fierce snowstorm was raging. Okay. The wind was directly astern, driving our slope at a terrific speed and was threatening every moment to capsize us. There was no time to lose. The sails had to be lowered immediately. Our boat was writhing in convulsions. A few icebergs we knew were on either side of us, but fortunately the channel was open directly to the north. But it would it remain so? In front of us, girdling the horizon from left to right, okay, was a vaporous fog or a mist, a black as the Egyptian night at the water's edge, and white like a steam cloud toward the top, which was finally lost to view as it blended with the great white flakes of falling snow. Whether it covered a treacherous iceberg or some other hidden obstacle against which our little sloop would dash and send us as to the watery grave, or was it merely the phenomenon of an Arctic fog? There was no way to determine. And then this is the last part that I'm going to stop at. And it says on page 9, Captain Perry's second voyage relates to another circumstance which may serve to confirm conjecture, which has long been maintained by some, that an open sea or free of ice exists or near the pole. On the 2nd of November, says Perry, the wind freshened up to a gale from north by west, lowered the thermometer before midnight to 5 degrees, whereas a rise of the wind at Melville Island was generally accompanied by a spontaneous rise in the thermometer at low temperatures. May not this be asked because occasioned by the wind blowing over an open sea in the quarter from which the wind blows? And tend to confirm the opinion that at or near the poles as open seas. On page 284, and this is the last part of his works, Hall writes, from the top of the Providence bird, a dark fog was seen to the north, indicating water. At 10 a.m., 3 men, Kruger, Nomenda, and Hobby, went to Cape Lytton to ascertain, if possible, the extent of the open water. On the return, they reported 7 open spaces and much young ice, no more than a day old, so that it was so easily broken by throwing pieces of ice upon it. Okay, and this is what they're showing the picture, and this is where we're going to stop. Okay, so he's giving accounts of what happened with him and his dad, how the voyage was, and then he's also laying in within the book other folks that have made the same trip and have given you accounts of what it was like. I'm very curious to learn about this Arctic fog and what the Smoky God really represents, okay? Because as we know, this is what the book looks like in the front cover. So it's a smoky kind of cover with the iceberg, and this is their little fishing vessel right here. So this is very interesting to me, you guys. I'm fascinated by all of this stuff, and we only have a page and a half left till we start chapter 3. Do you guys think I should crush this and just go ahead and read it really quick? I've got like a few minutes left on my clock here. I've got 5 minutes actually, and I'm at 28 minutes. So let's see if we can do this in 5 minutes or less. By what miracle we escaped being dashed to utter destruction, I do not know. I remember our little craft creaked and groaned as if the joints were breaking. It rocked and staggered to and fro as I clutched some fierce undertow of whirlpool or maelstrom. Fortunately, our compass had been fastened with long screws to a crossbeam. Most of our provisions, however, were tumbled out and swept away from the deck of the cuddy, and had we not taken the precaution at the very beginning to tie ourselves firmly to the masts of the slope, we should have been swept into the lashing sea. Above the deafening tumult of the raging waves, I heard my father's voice, "Be courageous, my son, be courageous." He shouted, Odin is the god of the waters, the companion of the brave, and he is with us. Fear not. Okay. Odin, Poseidon, Inky. Just saying. Same being. To me, it seemed there was no possibility of our escaping a horrible death. The little slope was shipping water. The snow was falling so fast and so blinding that the waves were tumbling over our counters in reckless white sprayed fury. There was no telling what instance we should be dashed against some drifting ice pack. The tremendous swells would heave us up to the very peaks of mountainous waves and then plunge us back down into the depths of the sea trough as we were fishing, sloping where a fragile shell, a gigantic white-capped wave like a variable walls fenced us in forth and aft. The terrible, nerve-wracking ordeal with its nameless horrors of suspense and agony of fear of indescribable continued for more than 3 hours. I would have been throwing up everywhere. I would have been heaving. I would have probably passed out. And all the time we were being driven forward at fierce speed. Then suddenly, as if the growing weary of the frantic exertions, the wind began to lessen its fury and the degrees to die down. At last, we were in the perfect storm, perfect calm. The fog mist had also disappeared, and before us lay an iceless channel, perhaps 10 or 15 miles wide, within a few icebergs far away to our right, and an intermittent archipelago of smaller ones to the right or to the left. I watched my father closely, determined to remain silent until he spoke. Presently, he untied the rope from his waist and, without saying a word, began working the pumps, which fortunately were not damaged, relieving the slope of the water it had slipped into the madness of the storm. He put up the slop sails as calmly as if casting a fishing net, and then he remarked that we were ready for a favoring wind when it came. His courage and persistence were truly remarkable. On investigation, we found less than 1/3 of our provisions remaining, while to our utter dismay, we discovered that our water casks had been swept overboard during the violent plunging of our boat. Two of our water casks were in the main hold. Both were empty. We had a fair supply of food, but no fresh water. I realized at once the awfulness of our position. Presently, I was seized with a consuming thirst. And it is indeed bad, remarked my father. However, let us dry our beguiled clothing, for we are soaked to the skin. Trust the god Odin, my son. Do not give up hope. The sun was here, beating down slantedly as if it were in a southern latitude instead of the far northland. I was swinging around its orbit, ever visible and rising higher and higher each day. Frequently mist covered, yet always peering through the lacework of clouds, like some fretful eye of fate, guarding the mysterious Northland and jealously watching the pranks of man. Far to our right, the rays deckening the prisms of icebergs were gorgeous. Their reflections emitted flashes of garnet, of diamond, of sapphire, pyrotechnic panorama of countless colors and shapes, while below could be seen the green tinted sea and above the purple sky. And I am done. That is all of chapter 2. Thank you all for joining me. When I come back, we're going to deep dive into part 3, Beyond the North Wind. And we're getting into this. I think this book is like not even 6 chapters. So we're going to get this one through. I wanted to interject and say that I wanted to read this because obviously it's a very short read. And then it ties in with the Reptilian, your Ascension, and also Claudio's work, as well as Tesla and the Cabbage Patch Kids, Tesla and the Cabbage Patch Kids, and how the world was reconstructed after the last mud flood or the last great reset. So everything is interlocking and it all ties in. And I hope this has been informative, beneficial, entertaining at best. And I will talk to you guys soon. Remember what I always say, be the change you want to see all around this Earth Dome, because it is up to you and I to make a positive change. Bye.